And as I thought about it, what struck me is what we don't understand, we tend to either ignore, neglect, or treat with contempt. And I just have the sense that that's what's happened to sleep over the last 100 years, and probably even more so in recent times, that it's just been neglected and treated as if we don't need it. But whether we like it or not, we all need sleep.
Welcome to the Different Kind of Psychiatry podcast brought to you by the ACO. I'm Dr. Crist Burritt. Each month, we feature a narrated article, case presentation, or interview or discussion with one or more of our doctors who practice a different kind of psychiatry. We're interested in your questions and comments, and I would love to hear your feedback. Send an email to aco@orgonomy.org. The best way to help the American College of Orgonomy spread its knowledge is by letting others know about us. If you enjoy the podcast, we'd appreciate you leaving a rating and review. If you're interested in attending one of our webinar presentations, you can meet the doctors and join in on the discussion afterwards. If you're interested in training with the ACO, you can learn more about the medical orgone therapy or social orgonomy training programs. You can connect with us and learn more at orgonomy.org. This episode features a discussion with Peter A. Crist, MD, about sleep. Dr. Crist reviews research, outlines a way to look at sleep functionally, and gives examples from the literature in his practice about how often sleep is ignored and yet how vital it is to human functioning. Well, Dr. Crist, I'm very happy to have you here today. Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So we talked about this idea of talking about sleep a while back. I guess the best place to start is just maybe say how you decided to look more about sleep, think about it more, and decide to give this talk.
Yeah, sure. Um, so what I would say where it really started for me recently to get reinterested in sleep. So it's something that's come up periodically, but a number of months ago, it's probably at least back in the summer. One of my patients actually often recommends interesting books for me to listen to. And he said, you got to listen to this book, Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. So I got it on Audible. I was listening to it. And every couple of minutes, I said, this ought to be headline news. Why isn't everybody aware of this? So it just got me thinking a lot more about sleep and then reflecting on, what I know about it. And it reminded me that I had actually listened to a book more than 20 years ago about sleep. And that book was The Promise of Sleep by William Dement. So Matthew Walker's book, I think it came out, I made a note. Yeah, it was in 2017. And Dement's book came out in 1999. And so I'm listening to Matthew Walker's book, and I said, wait a minute, this sounds familiar. It seems like I've heard this idea before about the detriments of sleep deprivation and the importance of sleep and how to look at it and that kind of thing. And so I went back and I got Dement's book again and listened to an abridged version. And I said, my God, I listened to all this stuff 20 years ago and I forgot it all, basically. And so that got me thinking about, so why is something so important so often neglected? And just this morning as I was walking around, that thing that everybody says, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Well, everybody talks about sleep, but nobody does anything about it. Now, that's not completely true, because I think there is actually a lot more focus on sleep and the importance of it, even that since Matthew Walker's book came out in 2017. So all of that got me going back to look at I realized there were some articles in the Journal of Orgonomy about sleep and two very in-depth articles by Dr. Harmon about the relationship between the autonomic nervous system and sleep. And little did I remember that there was a whole sleep issue that the journal published with several clinical cases, his article, an article by Dr. Konya about the function of dreams. And I will mention it if anybody wants to get it. That issue was volume 41, number 1, spring summer 2007. And then 2009, 42, number 2 is when the second article of Dr. Harmon's came out. So he was looking at things from a much more functional point of view than Walker or Dement, but it just sort of rounded out my sense of both Walker and Dement, said we spend at least a quarter of our life asleep, or ideally it would be good if we spend 8 hours out of the day. And yet sleep is still a mystery. People don't really understand it, don't really understand what it does, what its function is. So that just got me very interested in looking more. And the things that I kept saying, headline news, that Walker kept bringing up, I thought every doctor should be aware of the importance of sleep. And that's one of the things that Dement back in 1999 decried. So we can go into more of that, some of those specifics, but that's and so then I, again, really started looking at my own sleep as an example of someone who I think has neglected their sleep and now working very hard on changing that.
Yeah, well, wonderful. What you said that stands out to me the most, Dr. Crist, was just taking something that we all kind of see, but don't really see the whole picture or the significance of it. And I think that's what you're doing with this topic of sleep.
Yes.
Something that Wilhelm Reich was a genius out of, just seeing something that's there in everyday life, and we just kind of go past it. And I appreciate you stopping us all to say, wait a second.
Yeah, well, that's a great segue into what I realized as I was thinking about, sitting down and talking with you. There's no way in one podcast we can even begin to cover the breadth and depth of research about sleep. And so what I'm hoping maybe I can contribute something about functional thinking, how to look at this question rather than telling people what to think about it. As an example, this afternoon I said to my wife, what would you like to know about sleep? She said, well, how much I should get. And, so that I think is going to be a common reaction people are going to have. Tell me what I should do about my sleep. And that's something that sort of comes up with Walker, came up with Dement's book. And I don't think I'm in a position to tell people what to do about their sleep, but I hope I've looked at it enough and used the principles of functional thinking enough to help us just see how to look at it.
Okay. So
I'm
curious, how do we look at it?
Well, and I've said it in one of the other podcasts, is the basic approach to functional thinking, functional research is observe, observe, observe until a conclusion spontaneously comes to you based on what you're observing, not on some preconception. So I think that absolutely the same thing applies here. Part of the problem is, and I think it's part of why sleep is so neglected, is how do we observe sleep? So we're unconscious when we're sleeping, and that also came to me. The other quote from Wilhelm Reich that somebody told me that he essentially said the basis of all psychopathology is a fear of the spontaneous. Well, sleep is spontaneous, and you can't do sleep. You can't make yourself go to sleep. And even the terms we have, okay, you fall asleep. So the best you can do is set up conditions under which a spontaneous process will happen. So the tendency in our science of late is to be mechanistic and look at things as a machine. And so if you're going to look at sleep, how do you look at sleep without doing it mechanically? And
Dr. Chris, that's interesting. And you know, that's one of those words that I think I've passed by. You fall asleep, you know, like you fall in love.
yes, yes, love is a spontaneous process. You can't make yourself love, contrary
Yeah.
to the expression "make love." You can't make sleep any more than you can make love. So yes,
Yeah.
yep, yep, yep.
Yeah. And thinking about my own education, I think anytime it's come up in education for medical school or psychiatric residency, what's most clearly described and talked about are the most extreme disorders with sleep, whether it's the parasomnias that they call it, when you know someone has a severe post-traumatic stress and they have these terrible behaviors that interrupt their sleep, or narcolepsy,
Yep.
you know, these extreme examples of disorders with sleep, but the everyday problems that many people have, that's kind of not talked about.
Right. Well, that's one of the things I appreciated about Matthew Walker's book is he goes back really, a man after my own heart, to go back to the beginnings of biology and looking at the biology, literally, phylogenetically, and basically, he says, and I think the research is solid, that there is some function similar to sleep as soon as there are living cells. So even bacteria have a diurnal cycle of increased activity, decreased activity, then up through single-celled organisms to multi-cell organisms. Once you get into fish, amphibians, and so forth, the whole picture of sleep gets more and more, in a sense, complex, but clearer. So every living organism has some form of sleep. You don't really see stages of sleep until into the amphibians. But once you get into birds and mammals, you start to see, and that's what he describes, all of the stages of sleep that we know, non-REM sleep and REM sleep. So, so mammals and birds have those differentiated stages of sleep. So it might be useful, because I will use those terms,
Just to define them.
as we're talking about. Yeah, once someone invented the electroencephalogram, I think it was in the 1930s. They were able to measure brain waves, the electrical activity in the brain from skin electrodes. And so from there, they went to measuring that during people's sleep and identified very clear different brain waves when someone was asleep compared to when they're awake. So the early stages of sleep, the way the brain waves start to organize and take on a very deep rhythmic quality, whereas when we're awake, the brain waves are constantly sort of going without any organized rhythm to them. And then in the process of that, someone identified that it was with doing research on babies that there was a period where the eyes seemed to move very rapidly and had a very different brainwave pattern to that. So that they named, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. So that's all. It's just a descriptive term. And as Matthew Walker says, and sleep scientists being creative with their terminology, just called the others non-REM sleep. So there are stages of non-REM sleep, that from shallow, meaning it's easy to wake the person up, going down to deep levels of sleep where it's harder to wake them up. And then there's REM sleep, and the distinction between REM sleep and non-REM sleep, I think is a very, very important distinction, and has really piqued my curiosity. And it's well documented now that the primary period when people have what we usually call dreams is during REM sleep. And what's fascinating is that if you looked at an EEG, a brainwave pattern of someone awake and someone in REM sleep, you would not be able to tell the difference. So during REM sleep, the brain is as active as during the waking period, and the autonomic nervous system, so the part of the nervous system that is associated with basic life functions that we talk about and that Reich identified as associated with energetic expansion and contraction, that is more active during REM sleep often than even during waking periods. So I will come back to that because I think it's important then in understanding from a functional, even a clinical standpoint, what some of the functions of dreams may be. So let me so in Matthew Walker's book, when he's talking about the different organisms having sleep, there are some fascinating things, little details that came up, is that some animals will sleep with just one hemisphere of their brain and the other is awake. So sea mammals, all whales and dolphins, they can't go totally asleep or they would drown because they need to come up to the surface to breathe.
Right.
Literally, one half of their brain goes to sleep while the other is awake, and then will switch off, sleeping alternate halves. And he said the birds can do the same, and birds on a wire, they may be, the one at the end may have the eye that's open to watch out for predators. On that end of the wire is the part that's awake. The opposite end of the line of birds on the wire, their eye that's out away from the rest of the flock will be the one that's awake.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's, fascinating little details.
Yes.
Biology like that. So
Yeah.
the other thing that, in talking about REM sleep, I think, I don't remember if I just mentioned it, it did not evolve until warm-blooded animals. So birds and mammals have REM sleep. Reptiles do not. They have brain patterns that look like other stages of sleep.
So an EEG and identifying the variations or the various stages of non-REM sleep and REM sleep, that's one way to observe sleep.
Right. Yes.
Is that the only way to observe sleep? Is there more to it than that?
Well, I would say, interestingly, that's the major way that sleep research has been focused. But one of the things that Dr. Harmon brought out in his article is the approach to sleep follows very much the mechanistic approach of trying to identify the function of it by cutting it out. So, early neurology, the function of different parts of the brain would be determined by, let's chop out this part of the brain, or some accident chopped it out. Now let's see what happens. And so to deprive people of sleep, to see what the function of sleep is the equivalent of that. It's a rather crude way of looking at what the effects are.
Mm-hmm.
But there is tremendous amount of research that I would say the difference between Dement's book in 1999, he laid out the importance of sleep and all kinds of factors involved. By the time Matthew Walker wrote his book 20 years later, a lot of research had been done filling in explanations of what the basic principles that Dement had cited.
I see.
Much of Matthew Walker's book, he's looking at what are the effects of sleep deprivation, and that part is so crucial, I think. And I'll get back to some challenges about as I mentioned, the research with depriving people of sleep, but it's very clear that lack of sleep affects the person physically and emotionally on profound levels. So it affects the immune system, it affects the metabolic system, it affects our emotional integration. And, you know, I can talk about some specific things that have sort of come to my mind related to that. But, you know, one little example, I said, you know, why isn't this headline news? Well, depriving someone of sleep by having them have only 4 hours of sleep for a week at the end of the week with healthy people is enough to raise the blood sugar to pre-diabetic or diabetic ranges.
Wow.
And uh, reading just, you know, little details like that made me realize I need to ask my patients more about their sleep. And so there's one of my patients who I realized she often talked about, oh, she doesn't get to sleep till 2 in the morning, and she'll get up for a 10 o'clock session online with me. And I know she's also overweight and diabetic. And, you know, so talking with her just this week, she said, well, I don't understand why should lack of sleep affect diabetes? And, you know,
What's the connection?
what's the connection?
Yeah.
And so Matthew Walker alludes to it. If you read between the lines, almost every effect of lack of sleep is due to an overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, so the fight or flight stress nervous system. And so understanding that, I was able to explain to the patient, when we're under stress, our body puts out more blood sugar to have it available to deal with this stress. But if it's chronic stress, it's not just adrenaline that the body is producing, it's cortisol, the glucocorticoid stress hormone that, you know, if anybody's ever taken prednisone or one of the artificial ones, that's one of the warnings. It can aggravate diabetes. So again, just a way of understanding and putting those pieces together is something our understanding from orgonomy can really contribute to it. So,
Dr. Crist, I wonder if that's worth explaining for listeners. You mentioned the autonomic nervous system and then the sympathetic nervous system, maybe just in terms of how we see armoring and kind of that basic principle,
yeah.
maybe that would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, good. So the nervous system basically has two parts. One is called the central nervous system, you know, the brain and the spinal cord. And in his article, Dr. Harmon points out that that's really a misnomer. It really should be called the longitudinal nervous system because it runs up the entire back. So that's associated with sensations and voluntary muscle movement. Then we have the autonomic nervous system that's associated with supporting basic life functions, the heart rate, the digestion, the whole range of things. And that has two branches. The sympathetic, which is traditionally called the fight or flight part that is activated under threat. And then the parasympathetic is activated. And traditional medicine doesn't quite know how to classify that, but Reich was the one who clearly identified the sympathetic is associated with fear and anxiety, the contraction, the contractive emotions, and the parasympathetic with expansive emotions like joy.
Yes, I think in medical school and science, they often say rest and digest.
Rest and digest or vegetate, you know, just relax.
It doesn't quite encapsulate the
somehow traditional medicine doesn't know what to do with pleasure, I think is the basic problem. So what we understand is in essence the basis of all armor is a chronic state of contracting under threat during our development that we were never able to re-expand from. So literally the technical term is sympathetic atonia, an increased tone of the sympathetic nervous system. And that's really what Walker identifies as one example after another of the effects of lack of sleep. And one interesting fact that I didn't know is the risk of sleep deprivation is so great that Guinness Book of Records removed longest period without sleep from their records as being too dangerous to even encourage people to attempt to do. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, yeah. So that nobody anymore can
Good.
do a world record on how the longest period without sleep. He said, he points out, but there's the guy who dove from a balloon from the edges of space. That's in the Guinness Book of World Records. So that's less dangerous than going without sleep.
I could see more people trying for the lack of sleep than that one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Which kind of makes me think of just when we talked about the idea of talking about sleep, that's how I hear it. And probably because of, being in medical school and then being a physician, I think there tends to be a lot of physicians and maybe higher energy workers who tend to put sleep aside. And, there's all those quotes of "I'll sleep when I'm dead." And I
Yeah.
just heard a podcast about finance, and some brilliant, well-known financial investor guy bragged about how he had, I guess he has one of those like Fitbits, and he can measure how much REM sleep and non-REM sleep. And he was boasting about how much he had, and he only sleeps for 4 hours. And I think that's pretty common, unfortunately.
Yes, unfortunately, it's very common. And I didn't know that I had fallen prey to that. So back listening to the Dement back in 1999, I said, okay, sleep is important. I've got to take care of it. And then I think as my practice got busier, as I got busier with work with the college, then subsequently started working on my writing, I realized, one of the members of my writing group, I remember saying, with all of the other things you're doing, when do you find time to write? And I'm not an overt bragger, but I realized in retrospect, I was sort of bragging about, yeah, well, I stay up until about 1:30 at night editing things, and I get up. My best time to write is about 5 in the morning, and so I was really burning the candle at both ends without even thinking about it. But somehow with this idea, well, I don't need it, and Walker says he loves when he gives a public lecture, and there's always some macho guy or several of them in the audience saying, I do fine with 4 hours of sleep. And he says, I love telling them, well, 2 weeks of 4 hours of sleep instead of 8 lowers the testosterone level about from the level of a 40-year-old to a 70-year-old. He said, that doesn't get to them. He said there are studies that show it actually shrinks the testicles too.
That'll get their attention.
but the point with all that is somewhere there is that whatever you want to call it, macho driven. It's not just with men. I mean, it's with women too. Sleep's a waste of time. I don't need it.
Yeah. Honestly, the way I've heard it in women is slightly different. More commonly, that wake up a lot and will have kind of they might wake up for 10 minutes, they might wake up for 5, it might be a few seconds, rather than, burning the candle on both ends. And it's like that also somehow is just like acceptable, and there's no question about what's going on here.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And in a note that you had sent me, you said you haven't seen it as a prominent thing among patients, and as I said to you, I in my response, I really in asking patients in more detail about their sleep lives, realized it's like the difference between a symptom that someone is that disturbs them versus a character attitude that just feels like, oh, that's just me. I don't need more sleep. It's those unconscious ones that people are acting on that probably are the most problematic.
Yeah, I appreciate you pointing that out, because as soon as you said that, I said, oh, you know what? That's absolutely right. Yes, people will talk about it, but it doesn't flag in their mind as this is something I need to address. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that, and uh, I was the biggest example in my life in the last year or so, realizing, wow, I didn't realize how many times I was just sort of dismissing the importance or the significance.
Yeah.
I think this might be just even because my wife said, "How much sleep do I need?" Um, I there just sometime in this last week, my Apple News thing that comes up on my emails had a link to the 8-hour sleep myth, an article in the Wall Street Journal. And I said, let me look up what, the habit that's more important than 8 hours is what all they had on it. So it was weird. It was hard to track down, but I finally found the article by a link to another article that was in the New York Times about you're a psychopath if you wear socks to bed. But so that's the level at which the discourse is going on.
Yeah.
People are talking about sleep, but in some ways it seems way off the mark. But at any rate, what I found was that this article said a study had shown that more important than how much sleep you get. Well, it was a fairly large, I think like 15,000 people, a prospective study looking at death rate longevity in this population and relating it to the number of hours of sleep. And I don't even know the technology they use for determining number of hours, but and said that consistent sleep was associated with greater longevity, um, uh, more than the amount of sleep. But if you look more closely, they say, well, the people who lived longest were the people who got at least 8 hours of sleep consistently. So it's like everybody still wants to throw out, oh, we don't really need 8 hours of sleep. And that keeps cropping up over and over and over of, well, this study shows we don't really need that. And again, I think one of the problems is, and it's a basic principle in functional thinking that the Reich flagged. He said every phenomenon has both quantitative and qualitative factors. And looking at that argument, do we really need 8 hours or not? I realized that that's not even the point. It's not just quantitative. And my interest in word roots, of course, years ago I went back. Qualitative comes from the Latin root qualis, which means of what kind. Quantity comes from the Latin word quantus, that means how great. So you can't possibly know how great something is unless you know what kind you're talking about first. It's a basic principle in orgonomy, and it's what we do with our patients every day is we're looking at the subjective qualitative aspects more than we're looking at the quantitative objective aspects. So the quality of sleep is, I don't think you can say more or less important, but it's crucial, and probably it takes precedence over the quantity, I would say.
Yeah, and I think our modern culture with, whether it's caffeine and different medicines that make people stay awake, and then on the other side, sedatives and medicines that help people fall asleep. I mean, I think it's been known for years that even though you fall asleep with a sedative, the quality of that sleep is different.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that I appreciated from Matthew Walker, absolutely highlighting. He said, when I say people need more sleep, I don't mean they need sleeping pills, because he put it very nicely that unconsciousness is not the same as sleep. There is a functional process going on with sleep that's different than going unconscious. So all of the sedative medications, including alcohol, basically make the person unconscious. So may seem like it's helping you fall asleep, but it's not helping you sleep necessarily at all. In
Yeah.
fact, most of them, it's interfering with it. And he makes the point that alcohol disturbs REM sleep more than any other drug we know.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, Dr. Chris, because when we were talking about like my clinical practice, the most prominent patients that come to mind are patients who struggled with alcohol and then became sober, but still, I remember this patient actually still from residency who was sober for maybe 10 years, but still had tremendous difficulty with sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that brings back to, some of my thoughts about how to look at difficulty sleeping. So
Yes.
one of the things that came to me, that stuck with me, even though I'd forgotten so much else in Dement's book, is that some studies suggest that basically, and again, it's a mechanistic approach, but in lab animals, if you remove the sleep centers, the organism, the natural state seems to be to go to sleep. And so what he's saying then, any activation will keep the person awake. And I translated that into our ergonomic term that I find much more useful than activation is excitation. So if the energy is excited for any reason, it will make it difficult to go to sleep. And that excitation can be intellectual, thoughts running through your mind, emotional feelings, or it can be sensory, sound, light, touch, and that's been very helpful for me in just looking at what interferes with people's sleep.
Would you include with sensation like physical energy to move and
Yes, yeah. So, but the other thing, that sort of has come together for me in this, and it kind of came out. The company I consult with uh, brought in a new salesperson, and the CEO who is very favorable of me being involved with people with their company. He's found my work with him and advice with him very helpful. He said, "Would you have some meetings with this guy because he's having trouble sleeping and he's anxious?" And he says he's never an anxious person. So it was a wonderful little example for me of understanding the way I define anxiety for patients. I've found very useful. It's what we feel when an impulse does not yet have a satisfying outlet. So if when you said an impulse to do something, impulse to move, I think if that doesn't have an outlet, the person experiences something along the lines of anxiety, and that will keep them awake. So with this guy, and talking with him, realized, well, he thought he was going to come in and save the company as their new sales manager, because that's sort of part of his character, and we were able to identify that on the street. A buddy of his, had a seizure. He was the first to run over and help him out. His father is a fireman, and the two of them are always the first on the scene.
he takes action?
He's an action guy, and he was not able to implement every action he wanted in this new position. And so there's this natural impulse he has to do things and I helped him see, well, being a savior is not an impulse that's really going to be worthwhile to try to act out. But once he started getting that differentiation of focusing on, okay, this I can do, that I can't do, literally within 2 days. I mean, he'd never had trouble sleeping, but within 2 days, he was able to sleep better again.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, then in a follow-up, it's a little more trouble, but a few weeks later, and then he showed me, yeah, the biggest thing is I was worrying too much about not getting enough sleep. And now that I can just sort of put that to rest, and he showed me on his Fitbit watch or something. Well, I had so much REM sleep, so much stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 sleep, that I think I'm fine. But so again, a very satisfying little example of just using our functional understanding with quick advice.
Yes.
But as soon as he showed me that, I said, wait a minute, how can something on your wrist determine what stages of sleep? So that was in the back of my mind. And so one of my patients came in not long after I talked to her about her sleep, and she got Matthew Walker's book, and she came in with the ring, or an aura, called an aura ring, that measures sleep activity and so forth. And I looked into it more, and I said, my God, it's millions of dollars now in these fitness devices that are now tracking sleep, that people have been having trouble sleeping since the pandemic more than they had before. And it's a huge business. And I said, but how are they doing it? So they correlated EEG measurements in a sleep laboratory with what a device like that has an accelerometer, so you can tell hand movement or limb movement and heart rate, and a 90% correlation between those movements and heart rate and what an EEG would show as stages of sleep.
So it's like a proxy for a proxy.
It's a proxy for a proxy. But you asked, how else can we observe sleep? And I realized this now allows, I think, a whole new area of research that I think is already well underway of, rather than having to keep people awake, deprive them of sleep to see what the effects are, let's just measure large populations, how much they're actually sleeping and what happens with them. And I found it an exciting possibility that maybe, that idea of observe, observe, observe. I mean, the other simple definition Dr. Baker gives about functional thinking, it's thinking as nature functions. Well, this is allowing us to observe how people are naturally going about their lives without interfering too much. Though my patient did say, he said, the first night I had it, I kept waking up to look at my screen to see how much sleep I had. It was interfering with my sleep.
No, Dr. Crist, I appreciate that point of view, because that's how I've seen sleep talked about most recently in the last several years with all these consumer products. And I think my tendency was to just dismiss that maybe a little bit because there's so much marketing and sales involved.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I said, maybe that, this is just a mechanical sales pitch. And but I appreciate what you're saying, which is, well, let's look at this a little bit more and see how it can help us.
Well, as I say, any tool can either be used constructively or destructively. So,
yeah.
And, so just this last week, she told me a terrifying dream that she had had. And she said, and then I got up, I wrote it down. And in the morning, I looked up the time that I'd recorded that I'd had the dream. And it was after 45 minutes of REM sleep, and my heart rate went way up. So, just somehow, I think it's actually going to help her make more contact with what's happening in her body and her emotions, which brings me to, I think I may have said in something I sent you, I realized there is no such thing as a bad dream.
Yeah, I'm very curious to hear that. There was something intriguing about that statement.
Yeah. So a couple of patients said, I have had a bad dream. And I said, the dreams aren't good or bad in and of themselves. I mean, it was a disturbing dream. Yes, a very disturbing dream. And then, with this patient as well as another one, I said, the function of dreams, I think from all that we know now, is the autonomic nervous system is very active. It's discharging in the emotional realm things that don't get dealt with during our waking life. And it's serving a very important function. So it's actually a good thing that you're able to discharge that terror in your dream rather than walking around with it all day long. So that's what I mean by no such thing as a bad dream.
Yeah. How did the patient respond to that?
Oh, she said, well, yeah, yeah, and you know, I mean, people tend to get moralistic about not being moralistic. You know, oh, yeah, I shouldn't say bad. No, no,
Yeah,
it's not that you shouldn't say bad,
right. Yeah.
but it absolutely captured her, and
Yeah.
so she's now more aware of her dreams, and you know, I don't know what the effect will be, whether she'll allow them to happen more, but it reminded me of a patient I had years ago that I knew she was filled with fear, and she was too frightened and didn't trust me enough to really let it come out in sessions, but she kept reporting these terrifying dreams. And the only way that I saw the fear in her waking life is she was timid. She was afraid to speak up to her abusive husband. She avoided getting into any conflict. So that's, she was not in touch with the fear emotionally, but was aware of the effects of her avoiding the fear like that.
Mm.
And having terrifying dream after terrifying dream, she got better and better. And I said, wow, the dreams must be doing the work that we might often do on the couch in therapy. And
Wow.
I believe that's the case. Yeah.
Hmm. Very interesting. You made it a note about sleep being in the realm of coexistent action. Could
Ah.
you?
Okay. Now we get into terminology that is exclusive to orgonomy, that I don't think anybody else uh, uses these terms. And in fact, that term was coined by Dr. Cunha a number of years ago, working on understanding various functions or using the technique of orgonometry. So um, I think the simplest way to describe it is, with his orgonomic research, Dr. Konya identified the two variations of energy excitation are relative motion, things moving in time and space with a velocity, and coexistent action, which is the realm of attraction, associations, things that if if you're mechanical, everything is in the realm of relative motion. If you tend to be mystical, everything sort of gets in the subjective realm of, oh, that's a unexplainable thing. But for the first time, with that understanding about orgonometry, Dr. Konya identified a realm that is independent of time and length, independent of time and space. And it's that sense something just happens. Now, it's popular in mystical circles recently to talk about simultaneity. Um, there's people in quantum physics are talking about some basic principles. So if someone wants to go back, it's in one of Dr. Konya's articles in the Journal of Orgonomy about orgonotic contact. One of them is about the realm of relative motion and coexistent action. So it what happens in sleep seems to be it's independent of time and space, and but not totally. And Matthew Walker pointed this out very nicely. When you fall asleep, you can wake up and not know, was I asleep for 10 minutes or 10 hours?
Right.
But at the same time, you can tell yourself before you go to sleep, I've got to get up at 6:20, set an alarm for 6:20, and very often you'll wake up at 6:15. I mean, I know
Yes.
almost anybody I've talked to says, yeah, I know that can happen. So somewhere we're aware of time, but the process of sleep itself is in that sort of timeless realm. and dreams are clearly in the realm of associations. And everybody says, I had a weird dream. Well, is there one that isn't? And what makes it weird is it's not that everyday realm of, okay, I know I'm moving this fast through space, this much time happened. Things to put a dream into words, you're already into the realm of relative motion where you've got to line things up. This word comes before that word, before that word. And that's just not how dreams function. So the entire state of sleep seems to be our organism is in contact with that realm of relative motion, much more than, I mean, a contact realm of coexistent action. Things just happen simultaneously. Now, what is clearly known, as Matthew Walker talks about in his book from the research, is, and I think this is a fairly functional way of looking at it, is that when we're awake, the parts of our brain that process sensory input is focused outside us. It's taking in senses from the outside as well as in our body. But when we're asleep, particularly in the REM state of sleep, we're actively aware of sensations, but it's all internal sensations. So the autonomic nervous system is very excited, very active. So, and Reich, I think, was the one who used the terms, the basis of dreams is organ sensations. He used the term organ sensations, that we're in contact with our organs. So it's like our basic concept in orgonomy of contact is when excitation and perception become integrated. So we accurately perceive the excitation in our body or in something out in nature. We can make contact with someone else. But in sleep, it's like contact is entirely focused internally, whereas in our waking life, it's primarily external contact.
That's very helpful to hear it that way. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I hope that will be clear to people, because I'm using lots of what we would call orgonomic jargon words. They really have everyday practical implications.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about organ sensation, I think a lot of people might think of gut feelings that,
Yeah.
some people can get mystical about, but also just
Yeah.
having a sense of, okay, this feels, this is what I'm aware of. And at sleep, during sleep, maybe you're even more acutely sensitive to that because there's no other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And Dr. Harmon, in one of his articles, says that the mechanistic scientists, neurologists, sleep scientists focus that the sleep is all about the brain, and that's because their tendency is to look mechanically, like the brain is the center of everything that happens in our lives and it gives commands. But in fact, there's some new research that suggests that, and it makes perfect sense to me, that the signals for falling asleep don't come from the brain, but they actually come from the body. And Walker alludes to that with, the body temperature drops. And there's a whole array of things that goes on in the heart rate slows down that actually facilitates us falling asleep. So I think even the mechanistic researchers are accepting more and more that the body is an essential part of sleep. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've been talking about difficulty with sleep, not getting enough sleep.
Yeah.
What about the opposite side of the spectrum? Can people have too much sleep?
Very good question. So there have been a number of studies that got a lot of press over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, showing amount of sleep and longevity. And low amounts of sleep were associated with increased death rates. down to a range somewhere between 7 and 9 hours had the greatest longevity, and people who slept more than that had again an increased death rate, what they call a U-shaped curve. So I think a lot of people interpreted that, oh no, you can get too much sleep, it's not healthy. Walker explicitly says, now I have not had time to look up the research, but he explicitly says there's absolutely thousands of research studies that support the view that inadequate sleep is associated with increased death rate and reduced longevity. There is no study that supports the view that too much sleep is detrimental. He said the way he understands that is when someone is ill, a natural response is to sleep. It's part of the natural healing process, not just for rejuvenating the brain, but the entire body, the immune system, everything. And that why that curve looks that way is that people who are ill and more likely to die younger are sleeping more because they need to.
That makes sense.
It makes perfect sense to me. And it comes back to the other thing he says, as people get older, it seems to be harder to fall asleep. Older people tend to sleep less. And he said it's a big mistake to say that's because they need to sleep less. There's a difficulty in sleeping. And it's, to equate the amount with need is a mistake. And that makes sense to me too.
I'm curious, do you have any thoughts about beyond maybe illnesses that might interfere with sleep? Is there something about the armoring process or as people get older?
I don't know. I mean, to me, that would be very much
interesting question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Actually, I'm hoping that people would come away from this podcast with more questions than they came into it with. If they do, I feel like we will have been successful. So
yeah.
So I mean, again, there is just so much about sleep and the importance of it that we haven't even talked about. Where a lot of the sleep research started way back in the 30s was identifying that there is a rhythm to people's wakefulness and sleepiness. And I think it was in the 30s, some researchers went down into Carlsbad Caverns before it would have been a tourist thing, where it was totally dark, and they lived down there, I think, for more than a month, and monitored their how much they slept without any outside light influence. And they tended to maintain a cycle that was about 24 hours, but it wasn't 24 hours, which is now, instead of saying the diurnal cycle, we have the circadian cycle. Circa means about. So circadian means about a day. That's where that term came from. I didn't realize that. So the fact that it's with almost everybody a little shorter than a day means that cycle of when you're sleepy and when you're awake, if you don't have outside influences, is going to start shifting around the clock. And so this brings back, to what people talk about sleep hygiene. And I would encourage people to look up on the internet. I think the sleepfoundation.org has just sort of outlines of basic principles of sleep hygiene. But trying to get that cycle lined up with your day is very important. And so in essence, that cycle gets reset in the morning primarily by bright sunlight or bright light. So the advice is, as soon as you get up, get out in the sun, take a walk, expose yourself, your eyes and the rest of you, to sunlight to kind of reset your cycle. And then there's about a 90-minute cycle of wakefulness and sleepiness that is superimposed on that daily cycle. And part of sleep hygiene is at night trying to be sure that you have a regular, that's where the consistency comes in, have a regular cycle where you're catching your sleepy part. And the advice is if you can't get back to sleep, don't lie there fretting about it. After a period of time, get up, do something light, not with lights on, not bright lights, but maybe read a book, something calming, and go back to bed in a half hour to 45 minutes to catch the next drowsiness trough of your sleep cycle.
And drink more caffeine to even blast through it.
Well, yeah, I mean, what Matthew Walker explained something about the biochemistry of caffeine. It was beyond my clear understanding, but it really interferes with all of the rest of the processes that need to happen to go to sleep. So that even if you have a couple of cups in the morning, some people it's still interfering later in the day. So that's clearly one of the pieces of advice is don't drink any coffee or any caffeine substance during the day.
Dr. Crist, we were talking about the stages of sleep. Was there anything more you wanted to say about non-REM sleep or?
Just that again, its functions are still fairly, there's a lot we don't know. It's not as easy to identify, but again, using sleep deprivation studies for however flawed they may be, it's affecting, as I said, the immune system, even to the point that if someone wasn't well rested and got a vaccine, it probably wouldn't even mount an antibody response. Almost no point in getting a vaccine if you've not slept the night before. Things like that. And something that both Dement and Matthew Walker talked about is the problem of drowsy driving. And I just want to flag it. It's such a practical, everyday thing that all of the studies that have been done of looking at how someone's attention is when they've been sleep deprived, literally in a driving simulator. I think it was one night of only 4 hours of sleep was the equivalent of someone having 2 drinks in terms of their attention span, their capacity to respond to things. So drowsy driving is probably the basis of most automobile accidents. And he says far more than drunk driving. And there's thousands, millions of dollars spent on drunk driving education and just a minuscule amount on drowsy driving. And that as soon, and one of the disturbing things in the studies is the people who are sleep deprived believe they're doing better than they are. And I don't know how many times I've driven home late from the office and sort of feel a bit drowsy. Oh no, I can get there. He says you can't. You just can't. As soon as you feel drowsy, you've got to stop. Because what happens is a micro sleep. You fall asleep for 2 to 3 seconds, and that's enough to go off the road or run into somebody. And he said a drunk driver, you'll see skid marks because they are aware of it and they're trying to stop. A drowsy driving person who's fallen asleep, it's not an accident, it's a crash. There's no skid marks, they're asleep and until they crash.
Yeah. That's horrible. And what comes to mind is I like those billboards that say buzz driving is drunk driving, to get people aware that you don't have to be completely intoxicated to be impaired.
Yeah.
But it's almost like drowsy driving is,
Yeah, it is. And the other part of it that was so disturbing is when someone has not had enough sleep, the very perceptions we need to have to know that it's a problem are not there, just like marijuana. The very same thing we talk about, the perception someone needs to know that it's a problem are actually blocked. And both of them cite major catastrophes. You know, Chernobyl was probably from 1 a.m, sleep deprived nuclear plant operators, and the Exxon Valdez tanker disaster was sleep deprivation.
Maybe that points to some of the that question of how this is such a big problem, even beyond just driving, but just in a global way with your life, of how we all can be sleep deprived but aren't really looking at it in a productive way.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. And you know, when we talk about contactlessness, Dr. Konya used the term cluelessness. I mean, we're talking about the same thing. People being out of touch with what they need to know to protect themselves. And the other factor in that's a modern problem that they talk about is the looking at LED screens and the blue light of LED light emitting diodes absolutely blocks the production of melatonin, probably more than any other aspect of light. And you know, he clarifies the function of melatonin is not to make you go to sleep. It's, as he said, it's like the starting gun in a marathon to line the runners up, but the melatonin doesn't run the race. So taking melatonin late in the middle of the night to help you go to sleep is probably a placebo effect at best.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because that's become a thing too. I think the last several years, melatonin has skyrocketed as if it's some magic cure.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not well regulated. So you can get preparations that have almost none in it, others that are twice what they say on it. But
yeah,
so the other thing is, you know, the sleeping pills is probably the largest drug profit making area, and every one of them actually interferes with sleep. You know, and it's so important to work on finding other ways to manage sleep. And I really think it can be done. You know, as I tell people, you know, you need to burn off your energy, and so that's the other thing is exercise has an interesting relationship in studies with sleep. People who sleep better are more likely to exercise more. People who exercise more are more likely to sleep better. So, but again, if you think about it functionally, the any activation when you're trying to go to sleep, any excitation is going to interfere with sleep. So doing physical exercise should be earlier in the day. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but just keep in mind that you know the principle of you can't make yourself go to sleep. You can only set up conditions where you're more likely to fall asleep, and deal with any excitations that may interfere with sleep.
I appreciate you underscoring that, and that's what stood out to me from what you're saying of it's a process that you allow to happen, and then looking at thoughts, feelings, and sensations and physical energy, I think is a great way just to start looking at the process.
Yeah, and the other thing is, you know, in sleep hygiene, they talk about get rid of clocks in the bedroom. It won't help you to worry about, oh my God, I mean, it's going to interfere. I actually, one other thing I have noticed for myself, that what you were saying before, there might be an impulse to do something. So there are times where I might have trouble. I rarely have trouble falling asleep, but sometimes I'll wake up at night and have trouble getting back to sleep. And being able to tell the difference between this is just kind of neurotic anxiety that's gotten stirred up in me. I just need to let myself try to fall asleep versus wait a minute, this is on my mind. I need to get up and do it. And if I can get up and do it, I can often get back to sleep very, very quickly. So trying to sense which is which, I think is valuable for people to pay attention to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything more, Dr. Crist?
You know, there's a lot. There's a whole system called the instead of the lymphatic system, the glymphatic, the glial cells, the fluid in the brain, all of that literally is pulsating during the different stages of sleep, opening up and, in a sense, washing the brain with cerebral spinal fluid. So there's lots of anatomical, biochemical things that are known. It's known that certain stages of sleep are more associated with consolidating learning than other stages. So that, again, that one thing that's very clear is if someone learns a task and then sleeps, they were actually better able to do that task after a good night's sleep than before they, even if they practiced at it. And there's an example of a pianist who had trouble with a particular passage, practiced over and over, and would get up in the morning, it would be fine. So the idea of sleep on it absolutely is real.
Yeah.
One other thing about dreams that I had read bits and pieces. Again, that's one of the things I appreciated about Matthew Walker's book is that he brought in all kinds of examples, specific examples. Unfortunately, he didn't give credit to Dr. Dement for his work, which I don't understand. But you know, he's presenting his own things. But one of the things he brought in is, and it's what we know from interpreting dreams as psychiatrists, is the associations, as I said, can seem weird. So literally in REM sleep, people make connections they would not otherwise make. And an interesting kind of study, if you wake somebody up from sleep and then have them do a certain kind of puzzle or task, you're getting how their brain functions during that period of sleep. So wake them up from non-REM stage 3 sleep and have them do a puzzle. They will answer it differently than if you wake them up from REM sleep. And the kind of associations with REM sleep are much more distant associations, if you want creative, things that you never would have thought might go together. And so he cites several examples of creative things that have happened when somebody is sleeping. And one that I had heard of is the chemist trying to figure out the structure of benzene, this many carbon atoms, this many hydrogen atoms. He couldn't figure out how they could be configured, went to sleep, woke up from a dream of a rattlesnake biting its own tail. He said, "Oh, it's a ring."
Wow.
Yeah. And a couple of other great examples that I hadn't heard of is John Lennon composed Yesterday and I think Let It Be in dreams, woke up, said, "Well, that's a beautiful song. Let me write it down. I don't know where I heard that before."
Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. And then the chemist who is trying to understand how all of the elements fit together in the late 1800s, a Russian chemist, had cards with each element on it and couldn't figure out how to lay them out, went to sleep and woke up from a dream with the periodic table almost identical to how we understand it now. So, you know, incredibly creative things can happen in dreams.
Yeah. And what a kind of pushback against that push to, stay up longer and keep
Yes.
grinding at something rather than just allowing yourself to sleep and allow it to come to you.
Yeah.
You warned us at the beginning of this talk that we wouldn't possibly be able to touch on everything about sleep, and this is just the beginning. How might we summarize what we talked about today? What might you leave the audience with before we stop?
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you again for having me on to have this conversation with you about sleep. And yes, there's no way in this short period of time we can even begin to cover all about sleep. But there are a few things that come to my mind to just kind of pull it together to summarize. And one is to emphasize that sleep is a deep biological function that I think is as old as life itself, and that's what the research shows. And also, what struck me is that sleep has been a mystery for humanity, probably as soon as we developed the ability to reflect on ourselves and try to understand what's going on with us. So from that standpoint, I would say that mechanistic science and the books that I've referred to, particularly by Matthew Walker and Dr. Dement, from a mechanistic standpoint, have really started to reveal some of the secrets of sleep, particularly in the last 50 to 75 years or so. And what is absolutely clear, I think, is that sleep is essential for both physical and emotional health. And the other thing that you and I've talked about is that, and what a functional approach brings to it is sleep is a spontaneous process, and from that perspective, is really in a different realm from and other aspects really indicate that it's in a realm very different from so many other areas of our functioning. And as I thought about it, what struck me is what we don't understand, we tend to either ignore, neglect, or treat with contempt. And I just have the sense that that's what's happened to sleep over the last 100 years, and probably even more so in recent times, that it's just been neglected and treated as if we don't need it. But whether we like it or not, we all need sleep. And, if we look at 8 hours of sleep a day as probably roughly the healthy amount we need, that's a third of our lives. And if we shortchange it and get only 6 hours of sleep, that's still a quarter of our lives. So, the question is, how can we best harness the promise of sleep? And that was the title of Dr. Dement's book, The Promise of Sleep. And I think mechanistic science will continue to give us insights, but we absolutely need a functional approach. And that's what I had been hoping this would help continue some of the articles that I mentioned that are in the Journal of Orgonomy. But the key thing to remember is that taking a functional approach is really just at the beginning of the looking at sleep. And as I said, today can barely even do it justice. But a couple of things that we've not even really scratched the surface of is we haven't talked much about this, how essential sleep is for good social interactions and for relationships. And also we've touched on it, but not said a whole lot about the effect of good sleep on creativity and productivity. So again, those are areas to look at more. And so really, to summarize it all, I hope what people will get out of listening to this podcast is that the inspiration to examine their own sleep and take better care of it. And it struck me that it's also, I hope people will look at sleep and the effects of sleep deprivation on people that they are responsible for. So all of us in the medical profession, whatever level of the medical profession, to pay attention to how essential it is for people's health and how profound it can have an impact on any aspect of health that we may be trying to help people with. And also for parents to pay attention to the effects of healthy sleep or unhealthy sleep on their children. and for educators to be aware of it. We've touched a little bit on the effect of school schedules, but just for educators to be more aware of the importance of sleep. And an area we haven't really talked at all about is the effect of sleep in the realm of business. So for supervisors, business people, to pay attention to how it's going to affect people that they're responsible for, that report to them. And the bottom line is the implications for sleep and taking care of it, I think, are really profound and truly infinite. And so I hope this has just been the beginning. I hope people listening to this podcast will, as we say, take to heart what we've said and sleep on it and see how it may affect their own lives, and see where we go from here. I also hope that some orgonomists may listen to this and it will inspire them to look clinically at their patients, write articles from a clinical perspective, and also scholarly articles from a scientific perspective about sleep from a functional standpoint. So I hope this is just the beginning. And again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Crist.
Yeah, you're welcome.
How do you feel after listening to this discussion about sleep? What do you think? Since we first started planning this talk, I had tried to get more sleep, and to a degree I was successful. During the discussion's recording, as I listened to Dr. Crist describe how important sleep was, I was still hoping I could find a way to prove that surely this doesn't apply to me. Maybe 7 hours would be okay. It hit home for me, once again, how difficult it can be to submit to one's bodily feelings, including the need for sleep. The best way to help the ACO spread its knowledge is by letting others know about us. I hope you share this podcast with your friends and family and let them know about our work. You can connect with us at orgonomy.org. I'm Dr. Crist Burritt. Thank you for listening to the A Different Kind of Psychiatry podcast brought to you by the ACO. Since 1968, psychiatrists affiliated with the American College of Orgonomy have been helping patients discover greater satisfaction, health, and overall well-being in their lives. Whether patients suffer with mental illness, struggle with addiction, or feel unsatisfied with their work lives or relationships, medical orgone therapy, as practiced by the physicians at the ACO, offers a way forward, often without the use of medication.